maybe that's like a real point to add here with this whole conversation on bolting, is I think that when people like us just ramble about bolting, very few people actually have a good sense of what it takes to create a sport route, like how much work it is to get into position and drill the bolts and carry up the hardware, and like having the right size bit and making sure that it's the right size bolt for the right size hole, and making sure that it tightens correctly and that the rock isn't porous. And like there are all these aspects that go into successfully crafting a route that I think the average climber knows nothing about, and doesn't need to know anything about. But it just means that people wind up with semi-uninformed opinions about bolting, where it's like, oh, well, this route should just be totally different. And you're like, well, they did the best they could with the materials that they had and the time and the money available, and like they tried to create a good route. But there's a lot that goes into it, and it's just not that easy. You're kind of like,
And
it's like if someone's willing to put in all that work, just go with it. Be like, thanks for putting in all the work, and at least I have something to climb. Like maybe I wish I had another bolt or two, but it's like the first ascensionists did use their own time and money to create something for you. So it's like really all you have to do is say thank you and enjoy it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, especially in the case of like Yosemite, we're talking about, if you're talking about like a traversing bolted pitch on the like 11 pitches up, it's like a little bit askew from where you'd love it to be. I mean, is the first ascensionist really going to fly from New England all the way to the valley and like drive out there and then hike up and then go, probably not. And it comes back to what you said before, Alex, that like, as long as the first ascensionist is okay with it and there's somebody willing to put in effort to make the change, even like something as simple as a sport crag, it's got a long approach, carrying a drill is heavy, the first ascension has probably moved on to new cliffs or lives in a different place or whatever. And so
or they're just at home icing their back, whichever.
Yeah, exactly. and so, yeah, it's often, I think with so many things in climbing, stewardship related, it's easy to have this. I can't tell you how many times I hear this. Somebody should X. Somebody should really make this trail better. Somebody should really move that bolt. Somebody should really, and every time anyone says that in my proximity, I always just look at them and I say, that somebody is you. There's no like governing body that comes out to make these places better, to make routes safer, other than maybe necessarily the ASCA. But like generally speaking, if you make a comment like that, it might be a good segue to try and learn about like, okay, well, you really feel like it's unsafe? Well, maybe get in touch with the first ascensionist. Maybe they're like, hell yeah, dude, add 3 bolts. It'd be better. I agree. And then that's a great way for you to learn how to bolt. And in some ways, adding bolts to an existing route it could be a great like first experience of, putting a bolt in the wall.
On the other hand, or it's a way to suddenly have a good route with a bunch of weird bolts sticking out all sideways, kind of cockeyed.
Yeah.
It's like, because that's kind of the reality with bolting and doing first ascension in general, is that it actually is relatively difficult, and or it requires some skill, and it is something that you have to practice a bit. And the bummer is that you don't really want to practice on classic routes or like on things that other people are going to be climbing on. Basically, it's like ideally you practice on some scrappy little crag out in the woods that nobody's really going to go to. And then, if you botch a bunch of things, like it's fine, like it's no big deal. But, if you're at the money cliff, you don't want to be learning how to bolt.
Yeah, no, I agree. Maybe I take that back. I guess what I meant was that in a situation like that, with 100 people climbing the route, you'd probably have a really good idea of where you could clip from and where a good clip would be. And then on top of that, it's 1,000 times easier to bolt when there's already hardware in place and there's an anchor, and you can already free climb to the top to put the anchor up. That's all that I'm saying, because you basically remove like 75% of the picture as far as like figuring out where a bolt might go, and then also how to get like a rope or your body situated on the wall in a place where you could bolt.
The other day I was reading about something about route setting, and the person referred to it as graffiti. And it was like this really interesting way. I just never heard it described that way, but they're like, yeah, it's exactly like graffiti. Like these like holds go up on a wall. Eventually they come down, it gets covered up. There's new holds on a wall. Very much similar to like, the overpass, by our office right here. It's like, it changes all the time. And it's weird because I think we feel like some of the stuff that happens outdoors is more like a masterpiece, or it's more sort of set in stone. And maybe like I even hear sort of all of us there is like, it's not quite graffiti, like on that level, but it's not just like permanent. Like it is a conversation that will be had over time. And I don't know. I mean, I think it's kind of wild to think is like, I could see 30 years from now that there'd be enough climbers that that people might revisit things like, could snake dive be a little more accessible? Like, or something like that. And I'm curious, like, whether you guys think that that's maybe where we're headed, because I think looking back and the trend has been towards comfort. And there's also sort of like the realization that it's a more finite resource than we ever imagined. Do you think that we will see more revisitation in the future?
Well, I think that's where we're headed just because it is kind of a one-way road. Like it's easy to retro bolt things, it's easy to add more bolts, but nobody's going around removing all the bolts. And if they do, they're despised by the community for the most part. Like, anytime somebody removes fixed hardware, like steals bolts, any chops bolts, any of that, like generally everyone else in the community kind of hates them. So it's like, in 30 years, I'm sure routes are only going to be getting more. And you see that on El Cap already. I mean, like the Salate wall or the Freerider, which I've spent quite a bit of time on over the last 15 years, basically. They're now anchors.
Wait,
Yeah,
really?
Yeah. But no, there are all kinds of
Oh,
anchors.
you just went up there that one time.
Yeah, exactly. Just walked up to the base and I sold it. It's super chill. No, but there are anchors all over that route that didn't exist the first time I climbed the Freerider or the first time I climbed the Salate. And now you can sort of convenience rappel it by yourself with an 80-meter rope and just be like, cool, I'm just zipping down the wall. But 10 years ago, it felt pretty adventurous and sort of alpine to rappel El Cap by yourself. And now it's like they're nice chain anchors all over the place, and you're kind of like, it doesn't actually feel that committing anymore. Like it's just like a day at the sport crag, you're just zipping around. And it's like each time somebody adds one of those anchors, you're like, oh, this is convenient, this is nice, but nobody's ever going to remove that anchor. And so it's like you're really only making it more and more accessible forever. Like it's a one-way road.
So to be fair, with that specific example, like that is kind of one of the reasons why the NPS is considering requiring permits on El Cap. Like the chain of people wrapping in to like all variations of the Salate wall are like arguably making the route less enjoyable and less safe for like a lot of the people that are there. And I feel like, oh, I don't know what's going to happen like with this NPS permitting system, but I definitely know that like the people wrapping in
needing a permit to climb El Cap, essentially. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Isn't that for camping on the wall? Would that apply to people rappelling?
No, not necessarily. But like, I feel like that's one of the things in the discussions that they're like, oh, I don't actually know if permitting is that helpful because one of the things that's clogging up the route the most is people wrapping in now. And so I feel like, and I feel like a lot of these conversations come back to like, ideally, climbing community can just come to some consensus about ways to do things so that they don't become regulated, so that there aren't rules and permits and regulations and stuff around it. But I wonder if that's just like not going to be possible anymore. I mean, because all these things used to just be settled with like fisticuffs in the Camp 4 parking lot, and then like now that's not really the way we're like dealing with it. So instead, there's going to have to be other ways to deal with the fact that like we can't agree on things.
Yeah, I suggest Instagram.
Mountain Project Forum. It's where all the answers get.
That is where most answers get hashed out nowadays.
I see it as like
should we clarify to everyone that was a joke?
Yeah.
Just keep your thoughts in your own head.
This is a bit of a larger conversation, but unfortunately and fortunately, depending on how you look at it, the more people that want to access and make decisions about certain areas, the more important control and permitting and stuff like that becomes. I mean, you look at a situation like Waco, most of the boulders that I know feel that Waco is better than it used to be. And you look at a place like Rifle Canyon, there's no bolting there allowed without a permit. You look at the Flatirons in the backyard of Boulder, Colorado. There's a pretty lengthy permitting process involved with doing new routing in the Flatirons, including telling the land managers exactly how many bolts you're going to add to each route, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And for the most part, I feel like that is good. And the only reason that I say that is because I'm not always for regulation, but I just feel like in my experience with places like that, it's not completely shut out. So climbers are still able to go in and add new routes and exchange old hardware if they need to. Obviously, Waco is an example of that not being possible, which is unfortunate. But in the case of like Rifle and the Flatirons, for instance, climbers are having an open conversation with land managers, which is really important. Land managers recognize that climbing is important to that area. And then the end result is that you normally end up with better products in the end. The routes generally are better. There's fewer of them. They're not crisscrossing. There's not a ton of bolts, but there also are enough bolts that it's safe. And I think that as much as I hate to advocate for too much regulation, I do think that there are times, and this might be something like in the Valley or elsewhere that could help a place like Ten Sleep. I mean, I'd love to see the Bighorns get back to a situation where bolting was allowed, but it's just on a permit process. Because then we're able to slow down and have a conversation as a community about, oh, how many bolts should we have? Oh, you're going to have like 20 bolts for a 60-foot route. Like maybe that's overkill. Like, let's go back, let's take it back a notch, or maybe, let's talk about the type of hardware that you're going to put in the wall, or, let's talk about, and I think that then we're able to make all those decisions as a community and with the longevity of the area and the climb, on the forefront. And so I've seen most places with situations like that end up better in the end. And I don't, who knows what the fate of like Yosemite and other places is going to be, but I don't think as climbers, we should always, in summation, I don't think as climbers, we should always be so afraid of regulation. I think that in a lot of cases, it can actually make our experience better and make the longevity of the area more likely.